Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today we bring you a new story. Joseph's brothers tried to destroy him. What happened next changed history. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. The content of this video has been compiled from various sources, so if there are any omissions or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and add your insights. Thank you, and now, let's begin the story. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be hated by your own brothers, sold like property, forgotten in a foreign prison, and then somehow rise to hold the fate of nations in your hands? Joseph's story is often remembered as a tale of dreams and triumph, but the real story is far darker, far more human, and far more extraordinary. This is not just the journey of a favored son. It is a story of betrayal, power, trauma, survival, political genius, family collapse, and one of the most astonishing reversals in all of biblical history. Because Joseph's life was not shaped by one miracle, it was shaped by years of silence, suffering, difficult choices, and moments where everything seemed lost. And by the end, the question is not simply how Joseph survived. The real question is whether evil truly lost, or whether it was somehow transformed into something no one could have imagined. To understand Joseph, we have to begin long before the pit, long before Egypt, and long before the dreams that would make his brothers despise him. Because Joseph's story did not begin with ambition. It began inside one of the most emotionally unstable families in the entire Bible. Joseph was born into the household of Jacob, the grandson of Abraham and the son of Isaac, part of the covenant family through whom God's promises were supposed to continue. On paper, this was the chosen family, the blessed family, the family through whom nations would one day emerge. But the reality inside that household was far messier than the title suggested. Jacob's life itself had already been shaped by deception, rivalry, and emotional imbalance. He had deceived his own father, Isaac. He had stolen the blessing intended for his brother Esau. He had fled from home. Then, in a deeply ironic reversal, Jacob himself was deceived by his uncle Laban when the woman he loved, Rachel, was replaced on his wedding night by her older sister, Leah. What followed was not a peaceful family structure, but years of emotional competition between wives, servants, children, and inheritance tensions. In the ancient Near Eastern world, large patriarchal households were not unusual, but that did not make them emotionally healthy. Jacob had children through 4 women, Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah, creating a family structure filled with divided loyalties and invisible hierarchies. Every child was born into a complicated matrix of maternal rivalry, status competition, and paternal preference. And then Joseph entered that world, carrying a distinction no sibling could ignore. He was the firstborn son of Rachel, the woman Jacob had truly loved. That detail changes everything. Joseph was not simply another son. He represented Jacob's deepest emotional attachment. Genesis makes this brutally clear when it tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than all his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. Whether that phrase emphasizes age, maturity, or special affection, the practical meaning is unmistakable. Joseph was favored, openly, publicly, consistently. And in any family, visible favoritism is dangerous. In this family, it was explosive. The symbol of that favoritism became the famous garment, often translated as a coat of many colors. Modern imagination tends to picture a bright rainbow robe, but the Hebrew terminology is debated. Some scholars argue the garment may have indicated elite status, long sleeves associated with privilege, or clothing that marked someone as exempt from manual labor. In other words, this was not merely a fashion choice, it was a social announcement. Joseph was being marked as special, potentially even as a preferred heir in practical influence, regardless of birth order traditions. Imagine how this would have landed among older brothers who worked the fields, managed flocks, and already carried resentment toward the family structure that shaped them. Joseph's existence was not the problem by itself. The visible hierarchy was. And Joseph, at least in the early chapters, does not appear especially skilled at navigating this tension. Genesis tells us Joseph brought reports about his brothers back to his father. Interpretations vary on whether these were responsible reports or youthful tattling, but either way, the effect was destructive. Trust eroded further. The emotional distance widened. Joseph may have been innocent in intent, but innocence does not erase social consequences. What makes this story compelling is that Joseph does not begin as a polished hero. He begins as a young man inside a volatile environment, carrying privilege he did not create, but also lacking the maturity to understand how combustible that privilege had become. Historically, the world Joseph inhabited was harsh, tribal, and built around kinship survival. Family was everything. Land, inheritance, labor, identity, protection, and future all flowed through the family structure. To be alienated inside your own family was not merely emotionally painful. It was existentially dangerous. There was no independent safety net, no legal welfare system, no social mobility framework as we think of it today. The longing mattered. And Joseph's belonging was already compromised long before violence entered the picture. Yet beneath all the dysfunction lies a fascinating biblical pattern. Genesis repeatedly tells stories where younger sons disrupt expectations. Abel over Cain, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau. Again and again, conventional inheritance logic is overturned. The Joseph narrative enters that tradition, but with greater psychological realism than many earlier accounts. This is not abstract theology. This feels painfully human. Resentment here is understandable, even if not justifiable. Jacob's parenting decisions carry real consequences. The brothers' hostility does not emerge from nowhere. Even Joseph's later greatness cannot erase the fact that the conditions for disaster were carefully built over years. And that is what makes the opening of Joseph's story so powerful. This is not the beginning of a simple morality tale about a righteous young man opposed by evil brothers. This is the opening of a deeply layered human drama where love became favoritism, favoritism became resentment, and resentment was already moving towards something darker. Before Joseph ever set foot in Egypt, the real crisis had already begun at home. If Joseph's family was already fractured, the next events would shatter whatever remained. The resentment simmering beneath the surface in Jacob's household did not explode because of a single argument. It erupted because Joseph brought into that unstable environment something even more dangerous than favoritism: the suggestion of future supremacy. Genesis presents Joseph as a dreamer, but in the biblical world, dreams were not treated as random psychological fragments. Across the ancient Near East, including Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures, dreams were often regarded as meaningful, symbolic, and sometimes even vehicles of divine communication. That does not mean every dream carried sacred significance, but it does mean Joseph's family would not have dismissed such claims casually. When Joseph tells his brothers about the first dream, the symbolism is immediately clear. In the field, their sheaves of grain gather around and bow to his. The reaction is instant hostility. His brothers understand exactly what Joseph is implying, whether he intended arrogance or simple transparency. Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us? These are not casual questions. They reveal outrage at a direct inversion of family hierarchy. Joseph is younger. He is not the natural leader by convention. And yet here he stands, describing a future in which his brothers submit to him. Then comes the second dream, even more provocative. The sun, moon, and 11 stars bow before him. This time even Jacob reacts with alarm. Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? The emotional impact here is crucial. Joseph may have believed he was sharing revelation, or he may have been naively intoxicated by the attention such dreams created. The text leaves some ambiguity. But what matters is how the family receives it. To brothers already convinced Joseph is their father's chosen favorite, these dreams feel less like divine mystery and more like confirmation of everything they hate. Resentment becomes hatred. Hatred becomes intention. The narrative then shifts with deceptive simplicity. Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers, who are grazing flocks far from home. This decision seems ordinary, but from a storytelling perspective, it is loaded with tension. Joseph is being sent directly into the territory of men who despise him. He arrives wearing the visible symbol of favoritism, alone, vulnerable, unaware. Genesis tells us the brothers saw him from a distance, and before he reached them, they conspired against him. That detail matters. The decision to harm Joseph was not impulsive self-defense. It was premeditated. Their mockery is chilling. Here comes this dreamer. The language drips with contempt. Then they propose murder. Let us kill him, throw him into a pit, and claim a wild animal devoured him. What happens next reveals something psychologically realistic and morally complex. Not every brother responds identically. Reuben intervenes, apparently hoping to rescue Joseph later. This matters because biblical narratives often preserve moral ambiguity instead of flattening everyone into heroes and villains. Reuben is not noble enough to confront the group decisively, but not cruel enough to endorse outright murder. Joseph arrives. They strip him of the garment, the hated symbol of privilege, and throw him into a pit. The detail that the pit was empty and without water intensifies the horror. This is not symbolic humiliation. This is a death sentence by exposure, unless plans change. Then comes one of the coldest moments in Genesis. They sit down to eat. Imagine Joseph in the darkness nearby, terrified, pleading, while his brothers calmly have a meal. Later texts imply Joseph begged for mercy. The emotional brutality here is staggering. Yet murder becomes commerce. A caravan approaches, traders traveling toward Egypt. Judah proposes a practical alternative. Why kill our brother when we can profit from him? The logic is grotesque, but historically plausible. Human trafficking and slave trade routes existed throughout the ancient Near East. Individuals could be bought, sold, transported, and absorbed into foreign households or labor systems. Joseph, likely a teenager, is sold for silver like cargo. In one afternoon, the favored son becomes property. The covenant family's internal hatred literally converts a human life into economic transaction. Theologically, readers often focus on providence here, but the human reality should not be sanitized. This is profound betrayal. Joseph is not merely rejected, he is commodified by his own brothers. Then comes Jacob. The brothers slaughter a goat, dip Joseph's garment in blood, and present it to their father with calculated ambiguity. Recognize this, they say. Is it your son's robe or not? The wording is cruelly strategic. They never directly lie, but they manipulate Jacob into drawing the conclusion himself. This mirrors Jacob's own earlier life in unsettling ways. The deceiver is now deceived. The man who once used garments and deception to mislead his father is now shattered through a garment and deception. Biblical narrative often works with this kind of moral irony. Jacob believes Joseph has been torn apart by a wild animal. His grief is catastrophic. He tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth, and mourns deeply. His family attempts comfort, but he refuses it. He declares he will go down mourning to the grave. This is not temporary sadness. This is identity-level devastation. From Jacob's perspective, Joseph is dead. From Joseph's perspective, family is dead. And that emotional collapse is essential to understanding what comes next, because Joseph's journey into Egypt is not an adventurous new beginning. It is forced exile through trauma. The dreamer who imagined future greatness now enters chains. The beloved son becomes a slave. The protected child becomes radically exposed. And yet the genius of the Joseph story is that it never asks us to ignore the horror in order to rush toward redemption. It forces us to sit inside the collapse first. Because before Joseph ever rose, everything had to fall apart. At first glance, Genesis 38 feels like an interruption. Joseph has just been sold into Egypt, one of the most emotionally devastating turning points in the narrative, and suddenly the story appears to abandon him completely. Instead of following Joseph into slavery, the text pivots to an entirely different storyline centered on Judah, one of the very brothers responsible for Joseph's downfall. For many modern readers, this chapter feels awkward, disconnected, even unnecessary. But that impression disappears the moment we begin reading Genesis like an intentional literary narrative rather than isolated moral episodes. Genesis 38 is not a detour. It is one of the most strategically placed chapters in the entire Joseph story. To understand why, we need to ask a simple question. Why Judah? Why now? The previous chapter established Judah as the brother who proposed selling Joseph instead of killing him. Some readers interpret that as mercy, but the text is far less flattering. Judah did not rescue Joseph out of compassion. He monetized his brother's suffering. His reasoning was economic and self-preserving. Why spill blood when profit is possible? That matters, because Genesis 38 now takes us into Judah's own moral world. And what we find is not the portrait of a righteous leader. It is a story of compromise, failure, hypocrisy, and eventual exposure. The chapter begins with a striking phrase. Judah went down from his brothers. On a literal level, this may describe geographic movement. But biblical narrative often uses such language with layered significance. Judah is not only moving physically, he is moving morally and relationally away from the covenant family structure. He settles among Canaanites, marries into the surrounding population, and begins building his own household. In the patriarchal narratives, this is not merely background detail. Marriage choices carried covenant implications, identity implications, inheritance implications. Judah's direction is telling. He has stepped into morally unstable territory. Judah has 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Marries Tamar, but the text tells us was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he dies. The narrative does not explain the exact nature of his wickedness, and speculation should be restrained. What matters is what follows. According to ancient Levirate custom, a surviving brother could be expected to produce offspring with the widow, so the deceased brother's family line would continue. This was tied to inheritance, lineage preservation, and social protection for vulnerable women in patriarchal societies. Judah instructs Onan to fulfill this duty. Instead, Onan deliberately frustrates conception while still exploiting the sexual relationship. The text frames this as a serious moral offense, and Onan also dies. Modern debates around this passage often become highly distracted by later theological controversies. But in narrative context, the central issue is exploitation, covenant duty refusal, and selfish manipulation. Tamar is now twice widowed and profoundly vulnerable. Judah tells her to wait until his youngest son grows up, implying future fulfillment of obligation. But time passes, and Judah does not follow through. Whether out of fear, superstition, avoidance, or self-protection, he effectively abandons Tamar in social limbo. This is where the narrative becomes deeply uncomfortable for modern readers, because Tamar takes radical action. Learning Judah will travel nearby, she disguises herself, positions herself strategically, and Judah mistakes her for a prostitute. The encounter results in conception. Later, when Tamar's pregnancy becomes known, Judah reacts with moral outrage. Bring her out and let her be burned. The hypocrisy is staggering. Judah condemns publicly what he himself participated in privately. But Tamar has preserved identifying items Judah left as collateral: his seal, cord, and staff. These objects are not random. In the ancient world, they functioned as markers of personal identity and authority. Tamar presents them as evidence. The reversal is devastating. Judah is exposed not by rumor, but by his own symbols of power. And then comes one of the most important admissions in Genesis: she is more righteous than I. That statement does not mean every tactic Tamar used is being universally endorsed as ideal moral conduct. Rather, within the narrative framework, Tamar is recognized as pursuing justice within a broken system where Judah failed his obligations. The comparison is relative and deeply revealing. Judah, the powerful male patriarch, has failed covenant responsibility. Tamar, the marginalized outsider, has acted decisively to secure what was denied her. So why place this chapter here? Because Genesis is doing something far more sophisticated than simple biography. While Joseph suffers in Egypt, Judah's character is being exposed. And this matters enormously for what comes later. Without Genesis 38, Judah's transformation in the later Joseph narrative loses much of its power. When Judah eventually offers himself in place of Benjamin, that moment only carries full emotional force if we understand who Judah used to be. This is a man who once sold a brother for silver, a man who neglected family duty, a man who judged harshly while hiding his own guilt, a man publicly humbled through exposure. Genesis 38 lays the groundwork for redemption. It also contributes to a larger biblical pattern where morally compromised people remain central to covenant history in unsettling ways. Tamar becomes part of the messianic genealogy tradition, later associated with David and ultimately Jesus in the New Testament genealogical framing. That does not romanticize the dysfunction. It highlights how biblical history repeatedly refuses sanitized family narratives. Another literary detail deserves attention. Genesis 37 involves deception through clothing and false implication. Genesis 38 also revolves around disguise, sexual misunderstanding, withheld truth, and recognition through personal objects. The thematic echoes are deliberate. The family system itself is saturated with deception. Joseph's absence does not pause the moral crisis. It exposes how deep it runs. By the end of this chapter, the audience understands something crucial. Joseph is not the only person being shaped by suffering. Back in Canaan, Judah is undergoing his own painful unraveling. And without that unraveling, the reconciliation still to come would feel emotionally unearned. What looked like an interruption is actually structural genius, because the Joseph story is not only about one man rising in Egypt. It is about an entire broken family moving, painfully and unevenly, toward transformation. When Genesis returns to Joseph, the emotional contrast is striking. The previous chapter exposed Judah's moral collapse in Canaan. Now the narrative shifts back to Joseph, but the young dreamer we last saw is gone. The privileged son, wrapped in his father's affection, has disappeared into the machinery of the ancient slave trade. Joseph does not arrive in Egypt as a traveler, an honored guest, or an ambitious immigrant seeking opportunity. He arrives as property. That distinction matters. Modern audiences sometimes move too quickly from Joseph's betrayal to his later success, compressing the emotional reality into a simple underdog story. But Genesis does not present Joseph's arrival in Egypt as the beginning of adventure. It presents it as the continuation of trauma. He has been stripped of family, identity, status, homeland, and autonomy. In the ancient world, slavery was not a single uniform institution identical across all societies. But in every variation, the defining reality remained the same. A slave's life was controlled by someone else. Joseph's body, labor, movement, and future no longer belonged to him. Genesis tells us he was purchased by Potiphar, identified as an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. The exact administrative nuances of Potiphar's title are debated, but the broader implication is clear. This was not a rural farmer buying labor. Joseph entered the household of a powerful state-connected official, someone embedded within Egypt's elite administrative or military structure. And Egypt at this time represented something radically different from Joseph's previous world. Canaan was a land of semi-nomadic patriarchal households, kinship networks, and pastoral survival. Egypt was centralized, bureaucratic, urbanized, and politically sophisticated. Monumental architecture, hierarchical administration, agricultural planning, and state power defined Egyptian civilization in ways deeply unlike Joseph's upbringing. For a foreign slave teenager arriving in such a system, the cultural dislocation would have been immense. New language, new customs, new gods, new power structures. Total vulnerability. Yet Genesis introduces a phrase that will become central to Joseph's story. The Lord was with Joseph. This statement is theologically significant, but narratively it should not be misunderstood as immediate comfort or emotional ease. Divine presence in Genesis does not erase suffering, it reframes suffering. Joseph remains a slave. What changes is not the external label, but the trajectory of his experience within oppression. Genesis says Joseph became successful, and his master observed that what he did prospered. This raises an important question. What exactly made Joseph rise so quickly? The text does not depict magic. It suggests competence, reliability, administrative intelligence, character under pressure. Joseph appears to possess unusual organizational ability, trustworthiness, and discipline. These qualities matter enormously in elite households, where management efficiency translated directly into wealth and operational stability. Potiphar notices. Joseph gains increasing responsibility until, eventually, everything in the household is entrusted to him. This progression is remarkable, but historically plausible. Ancient elite households often functioned as complex operational centers requiring supervision of labor, resources, storage, provisioning, and property management. Trusted servants could wield significant delegated authority, even while remaining socially subordinate. Joseph is still legally a slave, but functionally he becomes a chief household administrator. That distinction is important because it explains how later developments become believable within the narrative logic. Joseph is no longer merely surviving. He is learning governance, learning systems, learning accountability, learning how power structures actually function. This chapter marks one of the most important transformations in the Joseph story, because adversity is reshaping him in ways privilege never could. Back in Canaan, Joseph was favored but inexperienced, protected but socially naive, emotionally significant but structurally dependent. In Egypt, survival requires adaptation. There is no father to intervene, no family safety net, no inherited status to lean on. Every step forward must be earned through demonstrated value. That makes Joseph's development psychologically compelling. Trauma does not automatically produce wisdom, but prolonged hardship often strips illusions. Joseph's earlier dreams may have contained authentic revelation, but at this stage, there is little evidence of youthful triumphalism. The focus is not on dreams, it is on disciplined endurance. Another striking detail appears almost casually in Genesis. Joseph is described as handsome in form and appearance. At first, this may seem incidental, but biblical narratives rarely waste characterization details, especially when they anticipate future conflict. The description echoes language associated elsewhere with physical attractiveness that becomes narratively consequential. Joseph's appearance, once perhaps part of privileged identity, now becomes another factor inside a dangerous power environment. But before that conflict arrives, this chapter deserves careful reflection for what it reveals about Joseph's emerging character. He does not respond to betrayal with collapse. He does not become passive. He does not appear consumed by self-pity. That does not mean he felt no grief. Genesis is often economical with emotional interiority. Silence should not be confused with emotional absence. What the text emphasizes instead is function under pressure. Joseph works, learns, adapts, earns trust. In modern storytelling terms, this is the quiet forging phase. Not glamorous, not miraculous spectacle. Formation. There is also an irony here worth noticing. Joseph's brothers tried to eliminate his future by selling him into slavery. Instead, they unintentionally placed him inside the most powerful civilization in the region, where he begins acquiring exactly the kinds of skills that will later matter at national scale. The story does not yet reveal that outcome, but retrospectively the architecture is brilliant. The trail becomes relocation. Suffering becomes preparation. Yet we must be careful not to sanitize that theological pattern into simplistic motivational messaging. Joseph's rise does not prove suffering is pleasant, efficient, or automatically productive. The text does not romanticize slavery. What it does suggest is that catastrophe does not necessarily erase purpose. By the end of this chapter, Joseph has accomplished something extraordinary, but fragile. He has rebuilt functional significance inside a system that once reduced him to property. He has earned trust in a foreign land. He has become indispensable in a powerful household. For the first time since the pit, life appears to be stabilizing. But Genesis is deliberately setting up the next collapse, because in Joseph's story, every ascent will be tested. And Egypt is not finished with him yet. Just when Joseph's life appears to be stabilizing, Genesis delivers another brutal reversal. This is one of the defining patterns of Joseph's story. Every time a sense of security begins to form, it is tested, shattered, or redefined. Joseph has gone from betrayed son to trusted household administrator. He has survived displacement, cultural dislocation, slavery, and the collapse of everything familiar. Against all expectations, he has rebuilt a place of influence inside one of Egypt's elite households. But now the threat will come not from jealous brothers, but from the dangerous intersection of power, desire, and accusation. Genesis introduces the crisis with calculated simplicity. Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. This is not a random descriptive flourish. In biblical storytelling, physical attractiveness often functions as a narrative accelerant, a signal that relational tension is approaching. But the deeper issue here is not beauty itself. It is vulnerability inside asymmetrical power structures. Joseph may be trusted administratively, but he remains socially exposed. He is still a foreign slave inside another man's household. That matters because when Potiphar's wife turns her attention toward him, the situation is inherently dangerous, regardless of Joseph's choices. The text tells us she repeatedly urges him to lie with her. This is not portrayed as a single spontaneous proposition. It is sustained pressure, persistent pursuit, a campaign of coercive temptation. Modern audiences often reduce this story into a simplistic morality lesson about sexual purity, but the actual dynamics are far more complex. This is not merely private temptation. It is a subordinate being pressured by someone positioned within the household's power hierarchy. Joseph's refusal is remarkable not only morally, but strategically. He frames his response through trust, loyalty, and reverence. Potiphar has withheld nothing from him except his wife. To violate that trust would be both personal betrayal and sin against God. Notice Joseph's development here. The young man who once seemed socially naive now demonstrates moral clarity, institutional awareness, and self-control under intense pressure. He understands boundaries. He understands consequences. He understands stewardship. And crucially, he refuses repeatedly. This is not momentary resistance. It is sustained integrity under repeated exposure. Yet this is precisely what makes the story psychologically realistic. Integrity does not always neutralize danger. Sometimes it escalates it. Eventually, the situation reaches a breaking point. Potiphar's wife finds Joseph alone in the house and physically grabs his garment, demanding compliance. Joseph flees, leaving the garment behind. The symbolism here is striking. Once again, clothing becomes central to Joseph's downfall. His special garment marked him for betrayal by his brothers. Now another garment becomes evidence used against him. Genesis repeatedly uses objects of identity and appearance as instruments of reversal. But beyond symbolism, Joseph's decision matters. He chooses escape over negotiation. He removes himself physically from the threat. Yet that choice does not protect him from what comes next. Rejected desire transforms into accusation. Potiphar's wife reframes the encounter entirely, portraying Joseph as aggressor. She uses language designed to inflame household outrage, emphasizing his foreign identity and framing the incident as humiliation against the Egyptian household. This is a textbook power reversal. The vulnerable subordinate becomes the accused predator. Her story weaponizes social hierarchy, ethnicity, and plausibility. In a world where Joseph's status is already precarious, credibility does not belong to him by default. When Potiphar hears the accusation, Joseph is imprisoned. The text is notably restrained about Potiphar's internal reasoning, and scholars have debated this for centuries. Some wonder whether Potiphar fully believed the accusation, given the relatively measured response compared to potential execution in such a scenario. Others caution against overreading silence. The narrative does not tell us explicitly. What it makes unmistakably clear is outcome. Joseph suffers catastrophic consequences despite doing the right thing. This is one of the most psychologically jarring features of the Joseph story. Modern moral storytelling often conditions us to expect immediate reward for integrity. Good choices lead to positive outcomes. Righteousness protects. Character wins quickly. Genesis offers no such simplification. Joseph behaves honorably and loses everything again. This is the second great collapse of his life. First, his brothers destroyed his world through betrayal. Now, a false accusation destroys the life he painstakingly rebuilt. The emotional cost would have been immense. Imagine the internal devastation. He had adapted, worked, earned trust, demonstrated excellence, preserved moral boundaries. And the result is prison. Worse, this is not merely imprisonment. It is a return to systemic powerlessness. Joseph has no family advocate, no public reputation strong enough to shield him, no institutional mechanism for appeal. In the ancient world, prisons were not generally rehabilitative systems as modern societies sometimes imagine them. They were often holding environments associated with punishment, detention, and harsh uncertainty. Joseph is once again at the mercy of structures larger than himself. And this raises one of the most difficult theological questions in the entire story. What does divine presence mean if catastrophe keeps happening? Genesis has already told us the Lord was with Joseph, yet Joseph remains vulnerable to profound injustice. This tension is not resolved cheaply. The text refuses prosperity logic. Divine favor does not equal immunity from suffering. Moral integrity does not guarantee immediate vindication. Faithfulness does not eliminate betrayal. In fact, Joseph's faithfulness appears to intensify his suffering in the short term. That realism is part of why this narrative remains so compelling. It does not flatter simplistic religious expectations. It confronts them. There is also narrative genius in how Genesis shapes Joseph's transformation. The spoiled son from Canaan is gone now, not because suffering automatically ennobles, but because repeated loss has forged depth. Joseph is becoming a man capable of enduring injustice without surrendering identity, a man capable of restraint under pressure, a man learning that control is fragile, reputation can be manipulated, and external stability can vanish overnight. These are painful lessons, but they are preparing him for responsibilities far beyond household administration. By the end of this chapter, Joseph is lower than he has ever been since arriving in Egypt. The brief season of recovery has ended in humiliation and confinement. If the story ended here, it would be a tragedy about exploited integrity and systemic injustice. But Genesis is not finished, because the prison that looks like Joseph's burial place is about to become the unlikely setting for the next stage of his transformation. If Joseph's life has taught us anything so far, it is that suffering in this story does not arrive in clean, dramatic bursts and then politely move aside. It lingers, it compounds, it evolves. The trail by family became slavery. Stability in Potiphar's house became false accusation. And now prison becomes Joseph's new reality. But what makes this chapter psychologically devastating is not simply confinement. It is delay. Because some forms of suffering are easier to endure when an ending is visible. Joseph's prison experience is far more cruel. It is uncertainty without timeline, injustice without explanation, and hope repeatedly deferred. Genesis once again tells us that the Lord was with Joseph, but the meaning of that statement remains deliberately complex. Divine presence does not unlock the prison gates. It does not clear Joseph's name. It does not restore his lost years. Instead, something subtler happens. Joseph once again becomes trusted within the very structure meant to contain him. The keeper of the prison notices him. Responsibility increases. Authority expands. The same pattern reappears. Competence under pressure. Reliability under hardship. Administrative excellence in constrained environments. Joseph is emerging as someone who creates order wherever chaos surrounds him. Yet this should not be romanticized. Influence inside prison is still prison. Functional responsibility is not freedom. Relative trust is not justice. Joseph remains a man wrongfully confined, cut off from everything familiar, with no visible path forward. It is here that Genesis introduces two new figures, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker. Their presence is significant. These are not ordinary inmates. In ancient royal courts, such officials held sensitive positions tied to the security and operation of the palace. The cupbearer in particular could be deeply trusted, given his proximity to the ruler's food and drink. Their imprisonment suggests some kind of serious political or court-related offense, though Genesis offers no details. What matters is proximity to power. For the first time since Joseph entered prison, a connection to Pharaoh's world appears. But Joseph cannot know that yet. What he sees are two troubled men. Genesis tells us Joseph notices their distress after troubling dreams. That detail reveals something important about his character. Trauma has not made him emotionally numb. He still pays attention to the suffering of others. He asks why they look troubled. This may seem small, but in narrative terms it matters deeply. Joseph is not consumed exclusively by his own pain. The men explain that they have dreamed, but there is no interpreter available. This moment is critical, because dreams re-enter the Joseph narrative with renewed force. Earlier dreams triggered Joseph's downfall. Now dreams may become the unexpected bridge toward his future. In the broader ancient Near Eastern world, dream interpretation was taken seriously in many contexts. Egyptian culture in particular preserved traditions where dreams could be treated as meaningful symbolic communications requiring skilled interpretation. Joseph's response, however, reframes the issue theologically. Do not interpretations belong to God? This is a subtle but important development. Earlier in life, Joseph was the dreamer. Now he positions himself not as autonomous possessor of mystical power, but as dependent interpreter under divine authority. There is maturity here, humility. The first dream belongs to the cupbearer, a vine with 3 branches, buds, blossoms, and produces grapes. He presses them into Pharaoh's cup and places it into Pharaoh's hand. Joseph interprets confidently. Within 3 days, the cupbearer will be restored to office. Then comes the critical request. Remember me when it is well with you. Show kindness to me. Mention me to Pharaoh. Joseph's words here are deeply human. This is not superhuman detachment. He wants freedom. He explains his injustice plainly. He was stolen from the land of the Hebrews. He has done nothing deserving imprisonment. This may be one of the most emotionally revealing moments in Joseph's story so far. Beneath the competence and resilience remains a man who longs to be seen, believed, and released. Hope rises. Then comes the baker's dream. 3 baskets on his head, birds eating from the upper basket intended for Pharaoh. Joseph's interpretation is devastating. Within 3 days, the baker will be executed. Both interpretations prove correct. The cupbearer is restored. The baker dies. Joseph's credibility as interpreter is confirmed dramatically. At this point, every narrative instinct tells us breakthrough has arrived. The connection to Pharaoh's court is established. Joseph has demonstrated extraordinary insight. The grateful cupbearer should remember him. This feels like the long-awaited turning point. And then, Genesis delivers one of its coldest sentences. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. The emotional brutality of that line is difficult to overstate. Joseph has endured betrayal by family, exploitation, slavery, false accusation, and imprisonment. Now, when legitimate hope finally appears, it dissolves into neglect. Not active malice this time. Forgetfulness. Sometimes human cruelty is intentional. Sometimes it is simple indifference. Both wound. And Genesis tells us Joseph remains there not for days, but for 2 full additional years. 2 years. Sit with that. 2 years after hope seemed within reach. 2 years after the apparent breakthrough. 2 years of waking up inside the same prison walls after believing release might finally come. This is where Joseph's story becomes psychologically profound in a way many simplified retellings miss. The hardest suffering is not always dramatic catastrophe. Sometimes it is prolonged obscurity after hope has already been awakened. Delay can be spiritually exhausting in ways acute crisis is not. Theologically, this chapter raises profound questions about timing, providence, and human expectation. Why allow the connection if nothing happens immediately? Why provide partial hope followed by silence? Genesis offers no direct explanation. The silence itself becomes part of the narrative experience. Joseph must live inside unanswered time. Yet, retrospectively, the delay matters structurally. If Joseph were released immediately through the cupbearer's intervention, he might simply leave prison and disappear into ordinary life. The 2-year delay positions him for a far larger encounter still to come. But that retrospective perspective is not available to Joseph in the moment. From inside the prison, all he experiences is abandonment. That distinction matters. Theological hindsight should not erase narrative realism. By the end of this chapter, Joseph is not rising. He is waiting. Forgotten by the man he helped, buried in institutional darkness. And yet, paradoxically, this is the final stretch before everything changes. Because sometimes the silence before the breakthrough is the part that feels most endless. After years of silence, the Joseph story detonates with one of the most dramatic reversals in all of biblical literature. But what makes this moment extraordinary is not merely the speed of Joseph's rise. It is the precision of timing. For 2 full years after the cupbearer's restoration, Joseph remained forgotten in prison. No rescue, no appeal, no visible movement. Then, suddenly, the highest office in Egypt is disturbed by something no power structure can control. A dream. Pharaoh dreams first of 7 sleek, healthy cows emerging from the Nile, followed by 7 gaunt, ugly cows that consume the healthy ones without becoming visibly changed. Then, a second dream follows. 7 full ears of grain appear, only to be swallowed by 7 thin, scorched ears. To modern audiences, these images may feel surreal, But in the symbolic world of the ancient Near East, dreams involving agricultural imagery, fertility, and natural abundance would not have been dismissed as meaningless nonsense. In Egypt especially, the Nile was life itself. Agricultural cycles determined national survival. A disturbing symbolic dream touching abundance and consumption would have carried real emotional weight. Pharaoh is troubled. He summons Egypt's magicians and wise men, but no satisfactory interpretation emerges. This does not necessarily imply Egyptian intellectual incompetence. Ancient dream interpretation traditions were real and sophisticated in their own cultural context. The narrative point is not that Egypt lacked expertise. It is that this specific moment requires Joseph. And only now does memory return. The cupbearer finally remembers the Hebrew prisoner who accurately interpreted dreams years earlier. The irony is staggering. Joseph's forgotten act suddenly becomes the key to national crisis management. Pharaoh sends for Joseph immediately. The transition is almost cinematic in speed. One moment, Joseph is in prison. The next, he is shaved, changed, and brought before the ruler of the most powerful kingdom in the region. That detail about shaving matters. Egyptian grooming customs differed significantly from Semitic appearance norms, and the preparation underscores Joseph's abrupt entry into a different cultural and political environment. Imagine the psychological whiplash. Years in confinement, then instant presentation before Pharaoh. The narrative tension here is immense, because this is Joseph's singular opportunity, and everything about his response reveals how profoundly he has changed. Pharaoh states the issue directly. "I have heard you can interpret dreams." Younger Joseph might have leaned into personal significance, but this Joseph answers differently. "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." This is one of the clearest indicators of transformation in the narrative. Joseph is confident, but not self-glorifying. He does not deny the gift, but he locates its source beyond himself. The dream is recounted. Joseph immediately recognizes the repetition as confirmation. The two dreams are one message. 7 years of extraordinary abundance are coming, followed by 7 years of devastating famine, so severe the years of plenty will be forgotten. This is already impressive interpretation, but Joseph does something even more remarkable. He moves beyond explanation into policy. He advises Pharaoh to appoint a discerning administrator, collect surplus during the abundant years, centralize storage, and prepare systematically for the coming crisis. This is a critical narrative moment, because Joseph is not merely presented as a mystical interpreter, he is revealed as a strategic thinker. Administrative intelligence cultivated in Potiphar's household and prison management now converges with interpretive insight. Joseph understands systems, logistics, resource planning, governance. This is not miracle without competence. It is revelation meeting preparation. Pharaoh's response is astonishing. He asks whether anyone more suitable can be found, someone in whom the Spirit of God resides. Then he elevates Joseph immediately, placing him over Egypt's administration second only to Pharaoh himself. The symbolism is deliberate and overwhelming. Joseph receives Pharaoh's signet ring, garments of fine linen, a gold chain, and public proclamation of authority. Once again, clothing marks Joseph's transformation, but now not as an instrument of humiliation. Garments now symbolize elevation. The ark is powerful. The robe of favoritism led to betrayal. The abandoned garment led to false accusation. Now royal clothing marks restored public identity. Historically, scholars debate the exact plausibility of every detail, especially regarding chronology and specific administrative titles. But the broad narrative logic remains coherent within ancient royal storytelling frameworks. Foreigners could rise in complex ancient systems under exceptional circumstances, especially where demonstrated usefulness intersected with state necessity. Pharaoh also gives Joseph an Egyptian name and arranges marriage to Asenath, daughter of a priestly figure. This marks deeper assimilation into Egyptian elite society. Joseph is no longer merely surviving in Egypt. He is embedded in its ruling infrastructure. Yet the story wisely includes something deeply personal amid the political transformation: Joseph's children. 2 sons are born before the famine begins, and Joseph names them Manasseh and Ephraim. These names matter enormously because they provide one of the clearest windows into Joseph's emotional interior. Manasseh reflects the idea that God has made him forget his hardship and his father's house. Ephraim reflects fruitfulness in the land of affliction. These statements deserve careful interpretation. Forgetting does not necessarily mean emotional erasure or betrayal of family memory. It suggests release from dominating pain. Fruitfulness does not deny affliction. It acknowledges growth within it. These names reveal a Joseph who has not become emotionally numb, but who has processed suffering through theological meaning. This is perhaps the most mature Joseph we have seen, not triumphant in shallow terms, but transformed. Then the years unfold exactly as predicted. Abundance arrives. Joseph executes the plan. Grain accumulates beyond practical counting. The narrative moves quickly, but we should pause here to appreciate what has happened. The teenage dreamer, once resented by brothers, has become the chief crisis manager of Egypt. The slave became administrator. The prisoner became strategist. The forgotten man became indispensable. But the story carefully avoids framing this as simple wish fulfillment. Joseph's rise is not compensation fantasy. It is responsibility, burden, national stakes. The years of plenty are not celebration, they are countdown, because Joseph knows what is coming. Famine arrives, and when scarcity begins crushing the region, Egypt has food, other lands do not. People come seeking survival, and with that detail, the narrative quietly sets the stage for the emotional collision the entire story has been building toward. Because famine does not respect family history. And somewhere far away in Canaan, the brothers who sold Joseph are about to discover that the world has changed in ways they could never have imagined. For the first time in Joseph's story, the danger is no longer personal. It is continental. The dreams Pharaoh received were not private symbolic puzzles. They were warnings about systemic collapse. And now that collapse begins. The 7 years of abundance end exactly as Joseph predicted, and famine spreads across Egypt and beyond. The biblical text presents this crisis not as a local inconvenience, but as a regional catastrophe severe enough to drive populations toward desperation. In the ancient world, this was not unusual in principle. Agricultural societies lived in constant vulnerability to environmental disruption, failed harvests, water instability, disease, and logistical breakdown. What made Egypt unique was not immunity from crisis, but its capacity for centralized response. Thanks to Joseph's planning, Egypt possesses reserves when others do not. Grain becomes power, access becomes survival, and Joseph, once sold as property, now stands at the center of one of the most strategically important systems in the known world. This is one of the most extraordinary reversals in Genesis, but the narrative does something intelligent here. It does not linger excessively on Joseph's administrative mechanics. The emotional focus shifts elsewhere. Because while Joseph now governs the practical realities of survival, the story's true tension lies in what famine does to the family he left behind. Scarcity has a way of collapsing distance. It forces movement. It strips illusions. It makes old histories collide with present necessity. Back in Canaan, Jacob hears there is grain in Egypt. The family that once casually sold one brother now faces existential pressure of its own. Jacob's reaction is telling. Why do you look at one another? The line carries frustration, perhaps even disbelief. Survival requires action. 10 of Joseph's brothers are sent to Egypt to buy grain, but one is held back. Benjamin remains with Jacob. This detail matters enormously. Benjamin is Rachel's other son. Joseph's full brother, and the emotional pattern has not changed. Jacob's protectiveness reveals that even after all these years, the old family dynamics remain alive. Joseph may be gone, but the hierarchy of affection persists. Jacob fears harm coming to Benjamin, just as Joseph was once sent into danger. History echoes. Yet the brothers go. And with that journey, one of the most emotionally charged encounters in biblical narrative begins. The text is almost painfully efficient. The brothers arrive in Egypt. They come before Joseph. They bow themselves before him with their faces to the ground. And suddenly, the dreams from Genesis 37 explode back into relevance. The sheaves bowing, the celestial bodies bowing. What once sounded like youthful provocation has become lived reality. But the emotional force here is not triumph. It is collision. Joseph recognizes them immediately. They do not recognize him. This is entirely plausible. Years have passed. Joseph was a teenager when they last saw him. He is now a mature Egyptian administrator, culturally transformed, linguistically adapted, clothed in elite authority, and socially unimaginable to them in this role. Recognition is asymmetrical, and that asymmetry creates immense narrative tension. Joseph sees everything at once: the men who betrayed him, the faces from the worst day of his life, the family trauma embodied before him, kneeling for survival. What does he feel in that moment? Genesis does not fully narrate his internal flood, but psychologically the possibilities are overwhelming. Rage, vindication, shock, grief, confusion, satisfaction, pain. Trauma memory is rarely neat. Recognition after prolonged, unresolved betrayal can destabilize even the strongest individuals. Joseph's response is striking. He speaks harshly. He accuses them of being spies. On the surface, this may appear vindictive, but the deeper dynamics are more complex. Joseph is not merely punishing them impulsively. He is probing, testing, assessing. He asks questions. Who are they? Where are they from? Is their story consistent? They explain they are sons of one man from Canaan. Honest men, they claim. The irony is thick. Honest men. Joseph hears this from the very brothers who sold him into slavery and deceived their father for decades. Yet the emotional complexity here should not be oversimplified into revenge psychology alone. Joseph is confronting unresolved uncertainty. Have these men changed? Is Benjamin safe? Is Jacob alive? Is the family structure still morally toxic? He cannot simply collapse into emotional reunion. Too much remains unknown. He demands proof. Bring your youngest brother. One brother will stay. The others may return with grain. Simeon is detained. The selection is narratively interesting, though Genesis offers limited explicit rationale. The greater emotional moment comes when Joseph overhears something transformative. The brothers begin speaking among themselves, believing Joseph cannot understand them. For the first time, guilt surfaces openly. They interpret their suffering as consequence for what they did to Joseph. They remember his distress when he begged for mercy. This detail is devastating because it confirms what earlier chapters implied but did not narrate directly. Joseph pleaded. The brothers ignored him. Reuben reinforces the guilt, reminding them he warned against harming the boy. Joseph hears all of this, and for the first time in the narrative, his emotional defenses visibly crack. He turns away and weeps. This moment is critical. Joseph is not emotionally detached strategist alone. Beneath the Egyptian authority remains the wounded brother. The tears reveal unresolved pain, but also something else: humanity. He is not dealing with abstract offenders. He is confronting shared history. Yet he composes himself and continues the test. The brothers are given grain. Their money is secretly returned in their sacks. This introduces further destabilization. On the journey home, the discovery terrifies them. Why? Because unexplained money could be interpreted as theft, entrapment, or disaster. Their fear reflects not only practical anxiety, but guilty consciousness. The family returns to Jacob, recounting everything, and Jacob reacts with anguish. Joseph is gone. Simeon is gone. Now Benjamin may be taken too. All these things are against me. It is one of the rawest emotional statements in Genesis. The irony, of course, is profound. Jacob believes reality is collapsing around him, while, unknown to him, Joseph is alive, powerful, and central to the unfolding resolution. But from Jacob's perspective, grief still defines reality. This chapter succeeds because it does not rush catharsis. It lets tension build. Joseph has encountered the past, but not resolved it. The brothers have experienced fear, but not transformation. Jacob remains trapped in partial truth. The emotional machinery is tightening, because the reunion audiences may expect is not yet possible. Not until the deeper question is answered. Are these still the same men who once sold their brother for silver? At this point in the Joseph story, the question is no longer whether Joseph survived betrayal. He did. The real question now is far more psychologically difficult. What do you do when the people who destroyed your life suddenly stand powerless before you? Popular retellings sometimes simplify this phase into a revenge subplot or a delayed family reunion. But Genesis is doing something far more emotionally sophisticated. Joseph is not merely confronting his brothers. He is confronting unresolved trauma, incomplete information, and the terrifying possibility that nothing has changed. The previous encounter ended in fear, confusion, and unfinished tension. Simeon remains imprisoned in Egypt. The brothers have returned to Canaan with grain, unexplained money in their sacks, and a demand that feels impossible. Bring Benjamin. Jacob's response reveals that the family's emotional architecture remains deeply damaged. Benjamin, like Joseph before him, is treated as specially protected because he is Rachel's son. The old favoritism still lives. Jacob refuses immediately. His words are saturated with grief and fear. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more. And now Benjamin. The tragic irony is painful. Joseph is alive. Simeon is alive. And yet Jacob remains imprisoned inside a narrative built on deception from decades earlier. Reuben attempts reassurance, but his proposal is disastrous. He offers the lives of his own sons as collateral if Benjamin is not returned safely. Rather than inspiring trust, the offer reflects desperation and poor judgment. Jacob rejects it. Time passes, and that phrase matters. Famine is not solved by one journey. Food runs low again. Scarcity returns with relentless pressure. Eventually, reality forces the impossible conversation. They must go back. Judah steps forward. This matters enormously. Earlier in the Joseph narrative, Judah was the brother who proposed selling Joseph. In Genesis 38, he was morally compromised, hypocritical, and exposed. Now he speaks differently. He insists the family cannot return without Benjamin, because the Egyptian ruler was explicit. More importantly, Judah personally guarantees Benjamin's safety. The shift is subtle but profound. Unlike Reuben's reckless proposal, Judah offers himself as accountable. Responsibility is beginning to replace self-preservation. Jacob, cornered by necessity, agrees. Gifts are prepared, double money is carried. Benjamin goes. The emotional tension here is extraordinary because the audience knows what Jacob does not. Benjamin is not walking into danger from a hostile foreign ruler. He is walking toward the brother everyone believes dead. When the brothers return to Egypt and Joseph sees Benjamin with them, something changes immediately. He instructs his steward to bring the men into his house for a meal, but the brothers interpret this invitation through fear. Their psychological state is revealing. They assume entrapment, punishment, retribution over the returned money. Guilt has altered how they read events. This is psychologically realistic. People carrying unresolved wrongdoing often interpret ambiguity through threat. Joseph's steward reassures them. Simeon is released. Then the meal unfolds with strange precision. Joseph enters. The brothers bow again, further fulfilling the dream imagery from earlier chapters. He asks about their father. Is he well? Is he still alive? Beneath the formal exchange, Joseph is gathering emotional truth. Then he sees Benjamin, his full brother, Rachel's other son. The emotional impact appears immediate and overwhelming. Genesis says Joseph is deeply moved and must leave quickly to weep privately. This matters enormously. Joseph's testing should not be mistaken for emotional coldness. Again and again, the narrative shows his restraint under intense feeling. He is not unfeeling strategist. He is containing emotional collapse long enough to complete something unfinished. The meal itself contains another revealing test. Benjamin receives portions 5 times larger than his brothers. Why does this matter? Because Joseph is recreating the emotional conditions that once produced family violence, visible favoritism, differential treatment, public inequality. Years earlier, Joseph's favored status helped fuel hatred. Now Joseph introduces a similar dynamic and watches what happens. The text offers no explosion, no visible resentment. This does not prove transformation fully, but it contributes evidence. The deeper test is still coming. Joseph commands one final setup. The brothers' sacks are filled with grain. Their money is returned. But this time, Joseph's personal silver cup is hidden in Benjamin's sack. After they depart, pursuit begins. The accusation comes swiftly: theft. The brothers respond with confident outrage, even invoking severe consequences if the guilty party is found. The search proceeds from oldest to youngest, heightening suspense with deliberate theatrical precision. Then the cup is discovered in Benjamin's possession. The emotional implications are devastating. Benjamin now occupies Joseph's former role, the specially loved younger son, the vulnerable, favored child, the apparent source of family crisis. This is the true test. Years earlier, the brothers removed a favored son and preserved themselves. What will they do now? The reaction is immediate and telling. They tear their garments in grief. This symbolic act matters. Earlier garments marked Joseph's destruction. Now garments mark shared anguish. And crucially, they all return with Benjamin to the city. No one abandons him. No one protects self-interest by walking away. The emotional geometry has changed. Back before Joseph, the accusation stands. Joseph declares the apparent verdict. The guilty one will remain as servant. The others may go home in peace. This is the exact kind of escape route self-preserving brothers once would have accepted. Benjamin can be sacrificed, their own safety preserved. Jacob's pain avoided indirectly by distance. Instead, something extraordinary happens. Judah steps forward. This is one of the great turning points in Genesis. The man who once profited from Joseph's destruction now offers one of the most moving speeches in biblical narrative. He recounts the father's attachment to Benjamin. He explains the family history carefully. He emphasizes Jacob's fragility, the previous loss, the emotional impossibility of returning without the boy. Then comes the decisive moment. Judah offers himself in Benjamin's place. Let the boy go. Take me instead. This is not symbolic remorse. This is substitution, self-sacrifice, transformation. And this is why Joseph tested them, not to indulge cruelty, not merely to generate suspense. He needed to know whether the brothers standing before him were still the men who sold him. The answer is finally becoming clear. The family that once sacrificed a younger brother to protect themselves is now producing a brother willing to sacrifice himself to protect the younger brother. That reversal changes everything. Because reconciliation without transformation would be sentimentality. But reconciliation after demonstrated change becomes something far more powerful. Joseph now stands at the edge of emotional collapse because the truth he needed has finally emerged. If Joseph's story were only about personal success after suffering, it would have ended the moment he rose to power in Egypt. But the true emotional center of this narrative has never been political elevation. It has always been family reckoning. Power alone cannot heal the betrayal. Time alone cannot produce reconciliation, and emotion alone cannot restore trust. Something deeper must happen. The previous chapter brought the brothers to the breaking point. Benjamin, the new favored younger son, stood accused. Joseph offered the exact kind of arrangement that once would have served his brothers perfectly. One brother lost, the rest free to go home. Years earlier, they had accepted something even worse. They had not merely abandoned Joseph, they had profited from him. So the question now is brutally simple. Have they actually changed? Judah's response becomes the answer, and it is impossible to understand the weight of this moment without remembering who Judah used to be. This is the same man who proposed selling Joseph rather than killing him, not out of compassion, but convenience and profit. The same man whose moral failures were exposed in the Tamar narrative. The same man who once prioritized self-interest over covenant responsibility. But Genesis has been quietly reshaping him across the story, and now that transformation reaches its climax. Judah steps forward and speaks, and what follows is one of the most emotionally intelligent speeches in the entire book of Genesis. He does not argue legal technicalities. He does not attack the accusation directly. He does not plead abstract innocence. Instead, he tells a story. He reconstructs the family's emotional reality for Joseph, though he does not know he is speaking to Joseph himself. He explains the old father waiting at home. He describes the beloved younger son whose absence would shatter that father's life. He recounts how another son is gone already, believed dead. The irony is extraordinary. Judah is narrating Joseph's own absence to Joseph. But the emotional significance lies in what Judah reveals about himself. He understands now what he once ignored. He sees paternal grief. He recognizes relational fragility. He takes emotional consequences seriously. This is not the language of the man from Genesis 37. Then Judah reaches the defining moment. He explains that he personally guaranteed Benjamin's return. If the boy does not return, the blame will remain on him forever. Responsibility is no longer theoretical, it is personal. Then comes the offer that changes everything. Judah asks to remain as servant in Benjamin's place. Let the boy go home. This is not merely apology through action, it is narrative reversal at the deepest structural level. Once, Judah participated in sacrificing a younger brother to preserve himself. Now, he offers himself to save a younger brother. The man who once sold another into slavery now volunteers for slavery. This is transformation, not sentiment. And that distinction matters because Joseph's testing has often been misunderstood. Some readers view Joseph's actions as emotionally manipulative revenge theater. Others defend them uncritically as pure wisdom. The truth may be more psychologically complex. Joseph is not playing games for entertainment. He is confronting an impossible relational dilemma. Reconciliation without evidence of change would be emotionally reckless. Immediate emotional reunion would ignore unresolved trauma, unanswered questions, and the real possibility that Benjamin might suffer what Joseph once suffered. Joseph needed to know whether the brothers before him were still governed by envy, self-preservation, and emotional callousness. Judah's speech answers that question more powerfully than any confession could. What Joseph hears is not performative remorse. It is costly moral transformation. The emotional tension at this point becomes almost unbearable because Joseph has achieved the knowledge he sought, but now must decide what to do with it. This is where the psychological realism of Genesis becomes extraordinary. Trauma survivors often imagine that clarity will instantly resolve emotional conflict. It rarely does. Knowing someone has changed does not automatically erase memory. Justice and mercy do not become easy companions overnight. Joseph now stands at the intersection of grief, vindication, love, anger, and possibility. And the text suggests the emotional pressure becomes overwhelming. Though the full release comes in the next chapter, this is the moment the internal collapse begins. Joseph's composure, carefully maintained through multiple encounters, is no longer sustainable. The test has worked too well. Another profound literary feature deserves attention here. Judah, not Reuben, becomes the moral spokesman of the brothers. This is significant because Reuben, as eldest, might traditionally have been expected to lead. But Genesis has deliberately repositioned Judah. His transformation prepares not only this emotional climax, but broader biblical trajectories in which Judah's line becomes central to Israel's later story. This is not accidental characterization. It is foundational narrative architecture. Yet the emotional power of this chapter remains intensely human. Judah does not know he is auditioning for redemption. He believes he is pleading before a foreign ruler. His willingness to lose freedom for Benjamin is therefore not strategic performance aimed at Joseph's sympathy. It is authentic sacrificial action under perceived finality. That authenticity is precisely what makes it convincing. By now, Joseph has heard his brothers admit guilt. He has seen them refuse abandonment. He has watched them share collective grief. And now he has witnessed substitutionary sacrifice. The evidence is complete. The family system that once produced betrayal has changed in morally significant ways. Not perfectly, not instantly, but genuinely. And that is why this chapter matters so profoundly. The Joseph story is not merely preparing emotional reunion. It is establishing the ethical conditions that make reunion meaningful. Forgiveness without truth can become denial. Reconciliation without transformation can become emotional fantasy. But here the groundwork has finally been laid. Joseph began this phase asking whether his brothers were still the men who destroyed him. Judah's speech provides the answer. No, they are not. And that truth is about to unleash the most emotionally explosive moment in the entire story. There comes a moment in some stories when restraint becomes impossible. For Joseph, that moment arrives here. After years of silence, betrayal, slavery, false accusation, imprisonment, political assent, emotional testing, and controlled distance, the carefully maintained barrier between who Joseph is and who his brothers think he is finally collapses. Judah's speech has done what no strategic maneuver could do. It has answered the question Joseph could not afford to leave unresolved. Have these men changed? The answer is yes. And with that answer, Joseph can no longer contain himself. Genesis describes the moment with extraordinary emotional force. Joseph orders everyone else out. No Egyptian attendants, no officials, no observers. This matters deeply. The revelation of identity is not staged as public humiliation. Joseph does not expose his brothers before the Egyptian court. He creates privacy. Even now, power is not being weaponized for spectacle. Then Joseph breaks. He weeps so loudly that the Egyptians hear it outside, and word reaches Pharaoh's household. This is not controlled emotion. This is years of compressed grief detonating all at once. Modern readers sometimes underestimate how psychologically overwhelming this moment would be. Joseph is not merely reuniting with family. He is confronting the human faces attached to the worst trauma of his life, now transformed, vulnerable, repentant, and standing within reach. Emotional release at this scale feels not only believable, but inevitable. Then come the words that freeze the room. I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? It is one of the most astonishing identity reveals in biblical literature. The brothers are stunned into silence. Genesis says they cannot answer because they are dismayed at his presence. The emotional meaning of that word matters. This is not simple surprise. It is terror, shock, moral collapse, existential disorientation. The brother they sold into slavery is alive. Not merely alive, but unimaginably powerful. The official before whom they trembled is the very person they betrayed. Every prior interaction now reinterprets itself instantly. Every harsh question, every test, every unexplained kindness, every emotional crack they failed to understand. In one sentence, the entire narrative shifts. Joseph invites them closer. That detail is beautiful and important. He does not maintain distance. He reduces it. Then he identifies himself plainly. I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Notice the realism. Joseph does not erase history with sentimental vagueness. He names the truth. Reconciliation in Genesis is not built on pretending the harm never happened. The betrayal is acknowledged directly. But then comes one of the most discussed theological statements in the Joseph narrative. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. This statement demands careful interpretation. Joseph is not declaring the brothers innocent. He has already named their action truthfully. Nor is he claiming evil actions become morally acceptable because good outcomes later emerge. Rather, Joseph introduces a theological framework in which human agency and divine providence operate simultaneously. The brothers acted with real moral responsibility. Yet their evil did not escape a larger providential horizon. This is sophisticated theological reasoning, not simplistic determinism. Joseph explains the famine has more years remaining. Egypt's preparation has become the means of preserving not only nations, but the covenant family itself. He urges urgency. Bring Jacob, bring the households, settle in Goshen. Survival now depends on relocation. But before logistics dominate, the emotional center remains personal. Joseph embraces Benjamin and weeps. Benjamin weeps in return. Then Joseph kisses all his brothers and weeps over them. Only then do they begin speaking with him. That progression is psychologically revealing. Conversation becomes possible only after emotional rupture and embodied reconciliation begin restoring trust. News reaches Pharaoh, and the political response is favorable. Joseph's family is welcomed. Transportation is provided. Resources are offered. But perhaps the most emotionally anticipated moment still remains, Jacob hearing the impossible news. The brothers return and tell him Joseph is alive. And not merely alive, but ruler over Egypt. Jacob initially cannot process it. The text says his heart became numb because he did not believe them. That reaction is profoundly human. Grief can calcify reality. When a person has mourned someone as dead for decades, resurrection-level news does not immediately feel plausible. Only when Jacob sees the wagons Joseph sent does the truth begin to penetrate. His spirit revives. The emotional language here is powerful. This is not mere intellectual acceptance. It is internal awakening. Israel, the text now calls him, declares that Joseph is still alive and that he will go see him before he dies. The naming shift is meaningful. Jacob, the grieving father, and Israel, the covenant patriarch, converge here. The journey to Egypt begins. Along the way, Genesis includes an important theological moment at Beersheba, where God speaks reassurance, affirming the move and promising continued covenant significance. This matters because migration to Egypt is not merely family relocation. It becomes the structural prelude to Israel's future national story. When Jacob finally meets Joseph, one of the most emotionally moving scenes in Genesis unfolds. Joseph presents himself, embraces his father, and weeps for a long time. The text does not over-explain. It does not need to. Years of false mourning, assumed death, unresolved absence, and impossible restoration converge in one embrace. Jacob's response is simple and devastating. Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive." This is closure not because all pain is erased, but because what was thought permanently lost has been restored. Yet this reunion is not merely personal catharsis. It changes history. The covenant family relocates into Egypt under protection, setting in motion the conditions that will eventually produce the Exodus story. What feels like emotional ending is actually national beginning. That dual function is part of the brilliance of Genesis. Personal reconciliation becomes historical transition. By the end of this chapter, the impossible has happened. Betrayed brothers are embraced. A grieving father is restored. A broken family is physically reunited. But one final layer remains unresolved. Reconciliation in the warmth of reunion is one thing. Trust after the father's death is another. Because beneath restored relationship still lies one final fear the brothers have not fully faced. What happens when Joseph no longer has any reason to restrain his power? If the Joseph story ended with family reunion, it would already be one of the most emotionally satisfying narratives in Genesis. But the biblical text refuses to end with sentiment alone, because Joseph's story was never only about survival, revenge avoided, or even reconciliation achieved. It was always about something larger: covenant continuity, historical transition, human transformation, and the mysterious relationship between evil and providence. The final chapter of Joseph's story does not simply close emotional loops. It reveals what the entire narrative has ultimately been building toward. The reunited family settles in Egypt, specifically in the region of Goshen, where they can preserve their pastoral identity while benefiting from Egyptian protection and provision. On the surface, this looks like resolution. Security has replaced famine. Family has replaced separation. But beneath the calm lies a historical turning point. The covenant family that began as wandering patriarchs is now rooted in foreign territory. This is both blessing and setup, because the same Egypt that currently preserves Israel will later become the house of bondage from which Exodus emerges. Genesis closes not with static peace, but with historical momentum. Before that larger future unfolds, however, the story attends carefully to the patriarch Jacob, now increasingly near death. One of the most fascinating episodes, often overlooked in simplified retellings, is Jacob's blessing of Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Joseph brings his sons before the aging patriarch, expecting conventional order. Manasseh, the firstborn, should receive the primary blessing. Ephraim, the younger, should receive the secondary one. But Genesis repeats one of its oldest patterns. Jacob deliberately crosses his hands, placing greater blessing upon Ephraim. Joseph objects, assuming confusion due to age. But Jacob insists the reversal is intentional. This matters far beyond family symbolism. Genesis repeatedly destabilizes conventional inheritance logic. Abel over Cain, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau. Now, Ephraim over Manasseh. The pattern reinforces a theological theme that divine purposes are not mechanically governed by human expectations of status, chronology, or hierarchy. Joseph, once the younger favored son, now watches a similar reversal unfold in the next generation. Then Jacob blesses his sons more broadly in what becomes one of Genesis' major farewell scenes. These blessings are not sentimental last words alone. They are prophetic, interpretive, tribal, and historically significant within Israel's narrative memory. Particularly important is Judah's blessing, which further reinforces the emergence of Judah's line as central in later biblical tradition. This matters because Joseph's personal prominence in Genesis does not translate into sole covenant centrality moving forward. The narrative is carefully widening beyond one man's biography toward national identity formation. Jacob dies, and Joseph's response is deeply human. He falls upon his father, weeps over him, and kisses him. Even after decades of restoration, grief remains grief. Healing does not eliminate the pain of final separation. Joseph oversees embalming, a detail reflecting Egyptian funerary practices and his embedded status within Egyptian elite systems. A significant mourning period follows, and Joseph obtains permission to bury Jacob in Canaan, in the ancestral burial site associated with the patriarchal family. This return matters symbolically. Even while living in Egypt, the covenant family's identity remains tied to the promised land. But then comes one final emotional crisis. After Jacob's death, Joseph's brothers become afraid. Their fear is psychologically understandable. Perhaps Joseph was kind only for their father's sake. Perhaps restraint dies with Jacob. Perhaps now revenge will come. Notice what this reveals. Reconciliation had occurred, but trust remained incomplete. Trauma and guilt leave long shadows. The brothers send a message claiming Jacob requested forgiveness for them. Scholars debate whether this report reflects an actual paternal message or anxious fabrication. Genesis does not explicitly resolve the ambiguity. What matters is the fear behind it. The brothers eventually present themselves before Joseph and offer themselves as servants. The imagery is striking. Once again they bow. Once again the dream imagery echoes. But the emotional context has transformed completely. Joseph's response is extraordinary. He weeps. Even now, their inability to fully trust his mercy wounds him. Then comes one of the most theologically profound statements in all of Genesis. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive." This sentence is echoed through centuries of theological reflection, pastoral counseling, and philosophical debate. But it must be handled carefully. Joseph does not deny the brothers' evil. He names it plainly. Their intent was destructive. Moral responsibility remains intact. Yet Joseph simultaneously affirms a larger providential framework in which human evil did not achieve final sovereignty. This is not simplistic fate. It is not moral relativism. It is not the claim that evil becomes good because good emerges later. Rather, Genesis presents a profoundly complex theology in which human agency and divine purpose operate concurrently, without collapsing into each other. The brothers intended harm. God worked through history toward preservation. Both claims stand simultaneously. This theological tension is part of what gives the Joseph narrative enduring depth. Modern readers sometimes crave cleaner philosophical systems. Genesis offers lived complexity instead. Joseph reassures them. He will provide for them and their children. The threat they fear will not materialize. This is not merely forgiveness as emotional release. It is active commitment to ongoing care. The reconciliation becomes durable. Joseph lives to see multiple generations, a sign of continuity and stability after a life once defined by rupture. Yet even Joseph's death is framed not as closure, but anticipation. He dies in Egypt, but not psychologically as an Egyptian. Before his death, he makes his family swear that when God eventually visits them and brings them out of Egypt, they must carry his bones with them. This is profoundly important. Joseph benefited immensely from Egypt's protection and power, yet he never treats Egypt as the final covenant destination. His imagination remains anchored in promise beyond present circumstance. This final request becomes a narrative bridge reaching directly into Exodus, where Joseph's bones will indeed be carried out. And this brings us to the deeper question. Was Joseph a historical individual exactly as narrated in every detail? Scholars approach that question with varying conclusions. Some note Egyptian resonances within the story, administrative plausibility in broad terms, and meaningful cultural texture. Others caution that literary shaping and theological composition make strict historical reconstruction difficult. Mature reading requires intellectual honesty here. The Joseph narrative functions simultaneously as sacred story, theological interpretation, ancestral memory, and literary masterpiece. But regardless of scholarly debates over specific reconstruction, The story's enduring power lies in what it reveals about the biblical imagination. Human evil is real. Family dysfunction is devastating. Trauma leaves scars. Power can corrupt. Delay can feel unbearable. Yet, suffering does not automatically erase meaning. Transformation is possible. Reconciliation can be earned through change. Providence may operate invisibly through profoundly broken circumstances. Joseph began as a favored son in a fractured household. He became a betrayed brother, a slave, a prisoner, an administrator, a reconciler, and ultimately a bridge between patriarchal promise and national destiny. His story is not merely about one remarkable life. It is about how biblical history understands suffering, identity, and hope. Genesis ends not with completion, but with waiting. A family preserved in Egypt, a promise not yet fulfilled, bones awaiting departure. And in that unfinished ending lies the opening of the next great story.